All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Orbit Learn webinar, Introduction to Generative AI or Gen AI on AWS. See if I can get the slide to go forward here. There we go. All right. So before we jump in, just very briefly, a little bit about myself. My name is Brett, and obviously I'll be presenting the webinar today. I got started working on AWS back around 2007-ish, I guess. And ever since that time, I've been either building, supporting, or running training solutions for customers on the AWS platform. And back in 2017, I decided to strike out on my own and start Curious Orbit. That's a little bit about myself. You can see a couple social links here. You can follow me on LinkedIn. We do weekly, what we call Orbit Live Let's Build sessions on Twitch. And you can also watch those presentations after the fact on my YouTube channel. So that's a little bit about myself. Before we jump into sort of the key services that I want to discuss today, I thought it would also be good just to set the foundation for some basic terms and concepts that I think are very important for us all to agree on, sort of understand exactly what they mean. So the first one is obviously why we're here. What exactly is generative AI or Gen AI? the the way I think about it, and the way you'll see most definitions, is Gen AI is really just a subset of artificial intelligence or AI, but it's specifically meant to generate new content. That content could be text, it could be images, it could be music, it could be code, it could be a whole bunch of things. And the way that Gen AI solutions generate this new content, sorry, is based off of the learnings that they've had over their lifespan. The training that they have allows them to generate this code. Whoops, wrong button. There we go. Um, You've probably already been exposed to Gen AI. I don't think there's a way that you couldn't at this point. But when we think about some very common use cases for Gen AI, things that we've seen people sort of start with, Gen AI is great at writing, creating writing content, whether you're using it to help you write blog posts, stories, or even slides for presentations. Yes, I used Gen AI throughout the process of creating these slides to help me validate ideas and just kind of organize my thoughts. Very helpful tool for that. You can use it to generate images, realistic images, artwork. And the slide at the beginning of the presentation is something that I built through a Gen AI tool. A little less common is video at this point, but I would suspect that we'll see this very shortly. But you can use it to generate video content. As I mentioned, music, whether you're creating sound effects, audio clips, maybe even use Gen AI to create the intro for your podcast or webinars. And then finally, one of the areas that I find really interesting is in the science and research areas. If you tune into our weekly podcast, Talking Cloud, Travers and I will often highlight articles where Gen AI is being used to assist research, whether it's new medical treatments, new medicines. And what we're seeing here is Gen AI is able to accelerate quite dramatically in some cases the uh, basically, or I shouldn't say accelerate, but reduce the amount of time it takes to get some of these treatments and new ideas to market. A couple other concepts that I think are important. A term that you might have heard is a foundation model or an FM. Think of a foundation model as a large general purpose AI model. And this model has been pre trained on a massive data set. And just like they're called here, they really act as a foundation or the base of whatever AI solution you might be using. We'll talk about that in a little more detail later on. They can be fine tuned to more specific use cases. The process of fine tuning is really just taking that pre trained foundational model and then adapting it for a very specific task. And some examples here of foundational models that we'll talk about here in a little more detail, things that are available on AWS: Titan, Amazon Titan, Claude, Command, Llama, Mistral. There's a whole bunch of foundational models that you can have access to and leverage on the AWS platform. Remember here that the key takeaway for this is that foundational models are broad, pre-trained models. And as we talk about the next slide here, we'll understand sort of how we take a foundational model and fine tune it into something else. Okay. And this is probably the term that most of you've heard most often, and that's a large language model or an LLM. And this is, again, a type of AI, but it's a specific model that's been trained, it's been fine tuned from a foundational model, and it's specialized in the fact that it's very good at generating human language. And like all AI models, we train these LLMs from mass amounts of data, and what we're really training it on is giving it the ability to mimic or predict patterns in human speech and text. Another really interesting term here is a small language model, an SLM. And this, again, is a different type of AI model. It's capable of let me try that again. It's capable of performing natural language processing, NLP, right? But it has far fewer parameters than a large language model. And think of a parameter as really a way that you could, well, adjust. I'm going to show you some examples of parameters, but how you could adjust your model to sort of influence the way it might respond. And SLMs are really interesting because they are obviously smaller than those large language models, which means they can be sort of more efficient and maybe even generate the solutions that you need, but for lower costs. All right, a few little housekeeping items before we start. I like to do this with all of the webinars that we do on AWS topics. The first thing here is to remember that what I'm going to show you, we're going to jump into the console, we're going to run some demos. These services cost money. The services that I'm going to talk about, they may offer free tier access, but it's really important before you do anything in AWS to understand the potential costs of enabling a service in AWS. So please take the time to understand the pricing models before you start turning these things on. Let's try that again. There we go. And you've probably heard a term called hallucinations. This is something that how we describe the fact that when you talk to an LLM, it's really using patterns in text. It's understanding of sort of predicting the next most logical word, and it doesn't necessarily mean that everything that you get back when you're talking to a Gen AI model is true. And again, if you've listened to our podcasts, you know I often use this term trust but verify. I use Gen AI every single day. It's a really important part of my daily workflow. And I can tell you from personal experience, it has streamlined how I work on things. And I do believe it's making me more efficient. But it's really important to make sure that you don't take what your Gen AI tool is telling you as absolutely true or correct. You have to verify that information. Okay, so with the housekeeping items out of the way, let's get to the sort of meat of the webinar today. And this is where we're going to talk about some key generative AI solutions on AWS. And before we get into that, I think it's important just to remember here that artificial intelligence, AWS has been doing artificial intelligence or providing AI services on the AWS platform for a long time. As I was building out these slides, I actually counted 34 different artificial intelligence services that are available on the platform. And to give you just a couple examples here, Recognition was released in 2016. As far as I could tell, it is the first artificial intelligence service that was available on the Amazon platform. If you're not familiar with Recognition was or is able to analyze both video and images. You can look for sentiment, specific people in those images. And then Amazon introduced just a couple other examples, Ollie in 2016 as well, where we could convert text to speech, and then Textract in 2018 to extract text from documents. It's important here to remember that if we think about the definition of Gen AI, what's different here about the Gen AI services that we're going to talk about here is that, remember, Gen AI is meant to generate new content, whereas these AI services, Recognition, Poly, and Textract, are not generating new content, but they're using machine learning to analyze, text, speech, video, images, whatever it might be. We're going to focus on two key Gen AI services. By no means are we going to look at every Gen AI service that's available on the AWS platform. So let's get started. The first Gen AI service is Bedrock. Bedrock is a fully managed AWS service. And what's great about using a fully managed service like Bedrock is it removes a lot of the underlying complexity. Right? Amazon used to use a term undifferentiated heavy lifting. I don't know, I don't see it quite as often, but essentially what this means is I can shift that undifferentiated heavy lifting. I can shift the responsibility of that to AWS and focus on what's important to my business, which is building a better solution for our customer. And this is a real benefit of any fully managed service in AWS, but in particular, something like a Gen AI service, Bedrock is sort of removing some of that underlying complexity. Another nice benefit about Bedrock is it has a large library of foundational models that you can use. You can see a list here on the slide, and they make it simple to use either through the management console for experimentation, but even more importantly, as you start to actually build out solutions on or leveraging the Bedrock service, we have a unified API that it has the ability to talk to whichever model we've decided to use. I'm not sure if I've mentioned this already. I'm going to show you this, but the Bedrock solution has what's called a playground, and I'm going to show you this in a second. The playground is a fantastic way to experiment with various models that are available on Bedrock, adjust the parameters for fine tuning, and just sort of see how it works. Right? Within the playground solution in the Bedrock console, you have a couple different options here. You have a chat playground. So this is where you can play around with chat models, submitting responses or submitting questions and getting responses. You've got a text playground where we can use text models, submit text, and get responses back. And then finally, we've got an image playground. I'm going to show you all of these here in a minute. The image playground is where we can generate images through descriptions of text. A couple things to keep in mind before I do a couple demos. First off, in order to actually, let me back up a little bit. Bedrock is not currently available in every AWS region. So you need to make sure that you're in a region that supports Bedrock. Okay. When I was creating these slides, there are 9 foundational models available on Bedrock. You do not have access to these models before getting started, whether you're using the playground or writing something more sophisticated with, let's say, making API calls. You need to request access to those models. So with that out of the way, let's jump over to the AWS Bedrock console, and I'm going to show you just a couple demos in the chat playground. Or I shouldn't say chat playground, but the playground. So let me change my share. Okay, so here we are. We're in the AWS Management Console. I've logged into my demo account, and I'm purposely in the CA Central region just to demonstrate something for you. You can see I've got Bedrock up here already. I use it, as I mentioned, quite often. But if you don't see Bedrock here, remember, you can always search up in the top console. Just type Bedrock. It's going to pop up. Okay. Since I'm in a region that is currently not supported by the Bedrock service, I have to change my region. So I can just click on one of these. We're going to use US East 1 or Northern Virginia today. I'll click on that, and we get the Bedrock console. Okay, so a little landing page for the service. And I'm just going to click the little drop down here, and I'm going to go to Overview. and you can see the various playgrounds. You can see some other things. Okay. The first thing I want to show you is how do you get access to these models? If you look down the left-hand sidebar, you can see under foundation models, you've got base models. Okay. And these are all of the models that are available. As I mentioned, I counted 9 foundational models that are available to us currently. Right here, they all, oops, one more. There we go. Okay. So these are the ones that are available. And you can see up here, you have to request model access. Just, I think, yesterday, Amazon introduced a new model from Mistral. So if I open up Mistral here, you can see, I think it was Mistral Small that they added. So if I scroll up and I can go request model access, and here are all the base models that are available to us. Okay. And I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to find Mistral. There's Mistral Small. Okay, I'm going to click this, right? So yeah, I don't have access. I'm going to request model access. And I've got it highlighted now. And I'll just say next. And I'll say submit. Okay. That might take a little bit of time, but that's how you add those models so that you can access them through the Bedrock service, whether you're using that through the management console or, as I mentioned, programmatically. Once you've done that, you can see over here, we've got our various playgrounds. So we're going to actually start with text. Okay. And this is sort of, I think, a simple but good example of the power of using generative AI for creating new content. So I'm going to just find I created myself a little snippet here that I could use. And I tried to copy this. Let me see if I can copy this. The other day when I was setting up for this, it worked one time and it didn't work the other. So let's see what happens. Oh, sorry, I got to select my model first. For this, we're going to use Titan, which is one of Amazon's models. This is a text generation model. So we're going to say apply, and then I can paste. So I've just got, create a story about a wizard who lives in a castle, right, et cetera, et cetera. And then over here are some of the parameters that we can adjust. I'm not going to get into the parameters today. We're going to leave all of these as defaults, and we're going to click run. Okay. And here is the output that the Titan text Gen AI model created for us based on our prompt. Okay. So that's one example. The next example I wanted to show you was the chat playground. So if we go over here, we're going to select our model again. This time I'll just change it up. We'll go Anthropic and we'll use Claude 3 Sonnet. So I'll say apply to that. And then I've got another little cheat sheet here. And we'll show you this. I mentioned already that we run a weekly podcast. We're actually doing the podcast right after this webinar. So maybe we'll see you there as well. And we actually have a workflow that takes the podcast text, the transcript from the podcast every week. We run it through Bedrock, and it generates sort of social posts for us, ideas on key takeaways and things like that. So I thought this was a valid example of how you might use the chat playground. So I'm just going to ask it to review the podcast episode from a particular location on our website. We'll click run, and it generates a couple key takeaways for us. And what I like about sort of the chat here is that we have context. So as we're talking to, in this case, Claude 3 Sonnet, it's remembering, it has context of our conversation. And I could continue this conversation and ask a sort of a follow-up question. Right. So now what I'm doing is I'm sort of setting it up. I'm saying you're a marketing expert. We won't dive into prompt engineering in this particular webinar, but it is something that's really, really important. So here I'm basically telling the Gen AI assistant sort of what it's good at. So it's a marketing expert. And I've given that marketing expert the 3 highlights that we created via the previous prompt. And now what I'm saying is, as the marketing expert, I want you to create 3 unique social posts that we could use to promote the particular podcast. So we'll run that. And what's happening here is it's using that context that it already has. And now it's saying, hey, here you go. Here's an Instagram post, a Twitter thread, whatever that might be. Okay. And obviously you can adjust these prompts the way that, or for whatever makes sense for you. Okay. So that's the playground, a great way to get started using the Bedrock environment without having to worry a lot about sort of understanding how to make those API calls and everything like that. I use this all the time. If you scroll down, one last thing before we leave this, you'll also notice down here some metrics on the model. So it'll tell you sort of how long it took, your tokens that were inputted, the tokens that were outputted, what it cost, those kinds of things. So let's flip back to the slides. All right, and that gets us to a really important feature of Bedrock. This is what's called an agent. Okay. And an agent is essentially an AI driven assistant that you could create that could help you run through more complex multi step activities. What we just did was really simple, right? It was kind of like ask it a question, get an answer. Easy. But what if you wanted some automation to improve your efficiency? Maybe you could create sort of a customer service agent, and that customer service agent is actually a Bedrock agent that is taking input from a customer and working through a multi-step process to try to answer that customer's question without having any type of human intervention. What's also really interesting about agents is that agents, once you've created them, you can securely connect them to internal company data sources. And those agents can use those data sources as part of its multi step workflow to help answer questions. Okay. Behind the scenes, what the agent is doing is breaking down that complex query into smaller tasks. And then the agent will work through those smaller tasks until it arrives at an answer, and it'll provide that back to whoever asked the question. And what's also really important about the agent feature of Bedrock is that it has, oh, I forget what the feature is called now. My memory's calling it a chain of thought. The way I think about it is you're able to go back and essentially understand the logic that that agent followed to get to its answer. So you can see exactly sort of how it formulated its response. So that is agents for Bedrock. The next really important feature of Bedrock is what's called guardrails. And guardrails allow us to do exactly what I put on this slide, create responsible AI applications. Think of guardrails as a set of policies that you can use to control the responses that your Gen AI application provides back to its users. Right. So you can filter, say, don't give advice on getting refunds, and I want a person involved in that. You can create policies or filters for, excuse me, certain terms, uh, responses. Maybe you want to protect people against hate speech or protect people against maybe inappropriate content. This is what a guardrail can do. It's important to remember that when you're building out your own solutions, guardrails are not there by default. You would have to add them to your solution. And finally, the last part of Bedrock that I want to mention is a knowledge base. And what a knowledge base allows us to do is extend our AI models with more specific data, right? What I mean by specific data is you think maybe you've got that agent that you've built, that's your customer service agent. Okay. And you tie it to a specific model, Anthropic, Claude, what we use, Sonnet, right? Claude 3 Sonnet. So you've got access now to that large language model, but you know that you're going to make this solution available to customers, and those customers are going to ask questions about your products and services. So you need to give that large language model additional context so it's able to answer those questions more accurately And that's really what a knowledge base does. You can create a custom knowledge base and then tie it to one or more corporate data sources. And as people are asking questions of your Gen AI application, maybe you're building a chatbot or something like that, what will happen is the model will pull in information from your sources that you've configured in the knowledge base and use that additional information to help add context and answer a customer's question more appropriately. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about this, I mentioned earlier on as we started the webinar that we do a weekly series called Orbit Live Let's Build. And we do this live streaming on Twitch. And we went through some early sessions. I think we've got 2 sessions so far where we're building out a Amazon Bedrock knowledge base, and we're building it out using CloudFormation. And there are 2 sessions that are available, and you can find those on the YouTube share or the YouTube link that was on the first slide. So that is the kind of the key features that I wanted to introduce you to in Bedrock. We're going to change gears and talk about, I think, another really important Gen AI solution in AWS, and that's Amazon Q. Think of Amazon Q as an AI-powered assistant that could help you or your colleagues, your employees, complete tasks more efficiently. Okay. And you can use Q in all sorts of different ways. Q is really a suite of services or a family of services, and you can use it to answer questions, generate, test, or modify code or debug code. Q can do all of that for you. And when you think about the different offerings that exist in Q, you've got Q Business, Q Developer, Q for QuickSight, Q for Connect, and Q for Amazon supply chain management. So lots of different choices that you're going to have to make when you think about Q. For today, we're really just going to concentrate on Q for Business and Q Developer. So let's talk about Q for Business or Amazon Q Business. This is very similar to a knowledge base in Bedrock. As I mentioned as we started the webinar here, I think one of the values of AWS since AWS really got started was their ability to abstract away the underlying complexity. And when I think about Q Business versus knowledge bases for Bedrock, I think of Q Business providing us with a higher level of abstraction. If you were to go down the Bedrock knowledge base path, there's a fair number of things that you have to take care of. Okay. With Q for Business, you abstract away that complexity again, and Amazon handles it for you. Okay. Ultimately, what Q Business allows you to do is create customized AI assistants, connect those AI assistants to multiple corporate data stores that you own and maintain, and you can do this securely. Okay. And then your employees or the users of your Q Business AI assistant can ask questions and find answers, again, using natural language. How does Q do this? It uses what are called business connectors. There are, as I was building out the slides, I counted about 40 different unique connectors that Q for Business supports at this point. And those connectors allow us to sync data from our data stores. And while there's like 40 connectors, I won't talk about all of them, but as examples, there is a web crawler. So you could point Q at your website. There is a Slack connector, so you could pull in conversational information from Slack. Another one is Jira. Okay, so these are all the different or examples of a couple of the connectors that you could tie to your Q Business Gen AI assistant, and then it syncs up that data and it uses that context to answer questions. Very similar to the Amazon Bedrock knowledge base. We also ran a series of Let's Build sessions on Twitch, building out an Amazon Q Business solution. And in that case, we used Python and Botto 3. And again, you can go off to our YouTube channel and find those if you're interested in learning more about those. And then finally, we've got Q Developer. Again, Q Developer is an AI assistant that can help your development teams operate more more quickly, more efficiently, get the assistance that they need without having to switch context, meaning you can integrate Q Developer here with a lot of sort of popular IDEs, which means you can stay right in that development environment and ask a question. And you can do a really simple question. And I'm going to show you a couple examples of this, but you can also, it has an agent based solution. So in this case, if you needed it to do more complex work, you can actually ask an autonomous agent to go off and do that work for you. Again, thinking about this like sort of more complex multi step workflow. It is important here, and I mentioned pricing earlier on. Developer has two pricing tiers right now. There's a free tier and a pro tier. Some of the examples that I'm going to show you in the little demo here would require a pro tier subscription. Okay. Currently, the pro tier costs $19 per month per user. But as I mentioned as we started the webinar, please always check that to make sure you understand the pricing models. Okay. A couple key takeaways here is that Q Developer can be integrated, as I mentioned, with a lot of modern IDEs. I'm going to show you, I use PyCharm, but it can also be integrated with Visual Studio Code, as examples. You can use the Q Developer solution from the management console itself. And if you're running on, I think it's only supported on a Mac right now, they even have a Q command line solution. Okay. So let's go and do a couple demos here to show you how you might consider using the Q Developer solution in your own workflow. So I'm going to go back to, we're going to start in the management console again, back to the management console. If I can find it, there we go. Okay. And I'll just go back to my landing page. And you'll notice over on the right-hand side here, we have a little Q icon. So I can open this up and I can ask it a question. You'll notice that, oops, I've got a question here already. Let's do new conversation. Okay. You'll notice here that I don't have a Q subscription right now in this account, so I'm using the free tier. And I can ask it a question. So let's say you're trying to figure out how to launch a new EC2 instance. Right, so we can ask it how to do that work. And it should come back pretty quickly. There we go. Okay. So it gives us the steps that we can follow. This is an example of what I mentioned earlier on, right? Trust, but verify. Just because this information is here does not necessarily mean it's correct. Okay. What I like about this is we asked it for the management console. Here are the steps to do that, but you can also do it programmatically. And this is really important. This is the source information that Q used to answer that question for you. I'm going to try something else. I'm hoping this will work. It's actually not what I was wanting. Q does have guardrails built into it. Let me try one more time. I'm trying to force a guardrail situation just to show you what it looks like. No, it's still not. What you might see here is it'll basically say something like, hey, you're asking me about something that I'm unable to answer, and here's why. That's an example of kind of a guardrail situation. Okay. So that's how you might decide to use Q right in the management console. The next example I want to show you is I'm going to change my screen share again. Going to go to my console here, and I do have the Amazon Q application, I guess I'll call it, installed on my Mac. Okay. So I can do something like this. Okay. So here we go. Now I'm chatting with Q through my management console, and I'll just ask it something similar like, what could I ask it? Could you show me Steps. Okay, so I'm asking it to show us how to create a new bucket. Ah, there we go. Right? It seems like it's outside of its domain of expertise. Let's try something else. Show me. Actually, let's do this. Explain how to best secure a web server running on an EC2 instance. There we go. It's thinking about it this time. Okay. So it's giving us some recommendations on how best to do that. Behind the scenes here, Q is using Bedrock. And so it's going through and very similar to what we saw in the console, it's giving us a reference here. So this is pointing back to particular documentation in AWS that you could use. So that's always valuable, right? If you want to verify what it's telling you to do here. Now, finally, I'm going to jump over to my PyCharm environment. I'm going to show you one more example. So if we go to PyCharm, somewhere it's here. There we go. Okay, so here's PyCharm. And I've already created a project. A couple things I want to show you is I've authenticated with Q. You can see it down here. So I can ask it a question right away. Okay. The other thing that I want to show is if you're using PyCharm, this is obviously you can translate exactly to what you're using. But if I click this, there we go. I've got sort of context for Q. So Q will create suggestions on the fly for you. You can pause that. Okay. It'll also run security scans for you on your code. You can pause that. You can run a particular scan against the project, force it to run a security scan for you. You can open up your chat console. You can open up your settings. Okay. There's this sort of context menu in all of the IDEs. Obviously, where it is in your IDE is going to depend on the IDE that you're using. Okay. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you sort of a more complex example. So I'm going to type /dev and I'm going to say, actually, let's start with a more simple. So I'm going to say, show me how to create a CloudFormation template that deploys an S3 bucket in US East 1. Actually, let's change it so it's not the default. We'll say CA Central 1. So this is like a one-off question. Okay, so it's working away. There's our CloudFormation code. It explains what it's doing or the logic that it used to create this for us. Let me make this window a little bigger. Okay, there we go. And again, references included, so we can go have a look at those. Another really simple thing, I do this all the time. I use a lot of Botto code. So what's the Python API call to copy an object to an S3 bucket? Destination bucket is, let's say is named S3 Gen AI webinar. So very similar to the last response, we get a little code snippet here with some explanation and references. Okay. Now I'm going to show you something a little more complex. We were talking about the fact that I'm going to open up a new chat window. Okay, we'll get rid of this one. Within the Q developer solution, we have access to autonomous agents that would go off and do some work for us. So I can use those by clicking or typing /dev. And I've got an example here. So I wanted to create a Lambda function that is invoked Okay, so that's our webinar bucket. For now, wow, can't type. Okay. So now what it's doing for us is creating a plan. So it's going off and it's essentially breaking this task. I know it's not a super advanced or a super complex task, but it's breaking that task into smaller tasks and going off and working on this for us. Let me make this a little bigger. Fill the screen up a little better, right? So just take a few minutes. It'll always take longer because we're sitting here waiting for it. While we're waiting, I did have one question, and the question I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, but it's basically saying, what is or what was the most challenging aspect of getting started with Gen AI when you started using it? And honestly, I would say the most challenging part was the prompt engineering piece. You I can't stress enough the fact that the importance of being concise, saying exactly what you mean, right? Giving it some sort of context, like as an example, you're an AWS security expert, you're a sales and marketing expert, you're an NBA, giving it a little bit of information like that to sort of tell it what it is and then ask your question. I think it took a fair amount of time for me to wrap my head around how best to structure those questions. And it's more of an art form than anything else. It's a lot of times you're going to have to iterate through to get to what you want. So structuring your prompts correctly, thinking about those prompts and making them precise is really important. Okay, so that's a good question. All right, so here's our response back. Okay. So here's we're going to create it. This is what it's going to do for it. So it's going to create a new Python file called lambda.py. In that Python file, it's going to create a Lambda handler. It's basically telling us everything that it's going to do. It's going to set up a new log group. Okay, all that great stuff. If I scroll down to the bottom, I can click generate code. Okay. Excuse me. And what it's doing now is it's actually generating the code that it described, sort of what its work or what it wants to do on our behalf. And again, we're waiting. While we're waiting, are there any other questions? Don't be shy. All right, no questions. It's kind of like watching a pot or a kettle boil, right? If we look away, it'll probably finish. I just want to show you this here in an example. This would be again a situation though that same phrase that I used earlier on, right? Trust but verify. Make sure that you understand the code before you run it, um, and do some testing. Make sure it does what you want it to do. While we're waiting for this, oh come on, I swear I did a little demo of this earlier on, and it did not feel like it took this long. I'll tell you what we'll do is we'll let that run in the background. And that's really the presentation for today, folks. So thank you very much for joining me. Remember, there are a couple links that I shared earlier on, or not links, but just sort of socials that I mentioned. Um, we broadcast weekly on Twitch. So it's twitch.tv/Curious Orbit. And if you can't come and watch the programming sessions live, you can watch all of that after the fact on the YouTube channel. So you can just go to youtube.com/at BrettG98 and you can follow along there if you'd like to see it after the fact. And I filled in enough time to go back to our PyCharm product here, our project. And here's sort of the diff. I won't show you the diff, but I can just say insert code. And here's the Lambda function that it built for us. Okay. And then you'll notice here, we can work on a new task. So maybe a follow-up question would be like, okay, great, build out a test suite that goes along with our Lambda function. Okay. So that's our introduction to Gen AI. Thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day. I know everybody's busy, so it's great to see a few folks here learning about Gen AI on AWS, and we'll see you soon. Thanks very much, and bye for now.